Hi everyone, and welcome to day 5 of All About That Place. We're on day 5 already, which is quite remarkable. For those of you that have stuck with us since the beginning, thank you very much. For those of you who are just joining now, that's quite all right. Everything here can be done pretty much at your own leisure. And I probably think that some of you will be doing the same thing twice or even 3 times. I know Liz has got 3 one-place studies, so I think they can get quite addictive, can't they? We talked yesterday about industry and occupation and about people, and I think we're focusing now in on people and around their life experience with education and how did people learn, what did people learn, and of course this is an important factor when you think about your own lives, and it's important that we think about this as well in the past. How did people in your place access education? We've had lots and lots of different forms of education in the past, as we have now, and this will vary quite a lot place by place, particularly when we think before the late 19th century and the advent, certainly in Britain, and as well as elsewhere, of standardized education. So when we're talking about education, of course, we've got particular schools and institutions. You may have other educational institutions in your place, but we've got to think about what particularly happened, what sorts of educations went on. We can think about things, of course, like Sunday schools that people might have gone to, different forms of Sunday school depending on your faith, or maybe just what was available. Things like universities, things like technical colleges, mechanics institutes that in Britain were brought along in the early 19th century. As well as things like workplace education, so things like apprenticeships, and this might be in things like guilds, but it also might be a much more informal apprenticeship from a master to apprentice, teaching us a trade like blacksmithing, for example. So you've got lots and lots of different ways of thinking about education. Natalie, I don't know if you've got any particular thoughts about researching education. What might you think about when you're looking at education from in a historical community?
Well, in the broadest sense, my own ancestors are generally very, very uneducated. So actually, as you were talking in that widest possible sense, I was actually thinking about some of the education you might get if you're unlucky enough to find yourself in the workhouse as a child, and actually including that in there. That would be something that for me would be of interest, because quite a lot of my ancestors were in the workhouse rather than any kind of formal educational establishment. And I tend to head over to Find My Past to look at their digitalized collections of education records. But if I was looking at a particular building, I mean, gosh, that's really wide, isn't it? Because you could go and find it on a map, you can find old images of it, you could go look in the newspaper and find out about who was there and how that's changed over time, different headmasters coming and going and bringing in different rules. I remember finding a wonderful article all about a school, and they had a lake attached to the school, and somebody was drowning and another pupil saved them, and I found that through the newspapers. So kind of looking at the kind of story elements around the schools and establishments as well.
Yeah, I think the stories, what can you get out of them? You might be able to get just a broad sense from what exists, or you might be lucky enough to have, educational, records of that institution, school books, log books, that kind of thing, reminiscences around what school life might have been like. I like what you say about the education. Yeah, you take it in the widest possible sense. My granddad, who left school at 16, and I don't think attended much school before then, always likes to say that he never let school get in the way of his education. So I think that's something that we need to consider as well. What did people learn on the job in the community? And also thinking about in that vein, in my own one-place study, there is record of a school much earlier, actually, and endowments for a school in the 17th century. Whereas actually the official sort of history of the place that was written about 1900 actually doesn't record that, and says that the first school was set up through the church, and it was a church-based thing. Some sort of generations after we know that actually there was somebody and several people actually who left money in their wills for the setting up of the school. So we've got to think about, what are the stories being told? It's all very well to accept what is said on one perspective, but actually looking at lots of different sources and sources you may not expect to think about education. And this isn't, of course, all that we're focusing on for tasks for today. And we want to think as well about the establishment. So who worked in this place, you know, who attended, what was daily life like, you know, and if you can get at some of this, I think this is really important. And of course, a learning establishment, as we've mentioned, could be a number of different things. It can be a form of workplace. It can be something that is set up particularly as a school itself. Quite often schools and classes were taken outside of what we might today consider being a school, a formal school building. You may have a school building in your place that you can look at. And also the people that work there, because of course we're thinking about the pupils and the students of various kinds. But we also got to think about the teachers, you know, who were the teachers in particular places. They might be ministers, they might have some sort of relationship to the church. They may be other kinds of people entirely. Quite often, actually, particularly in smaller places, if we're thinking about rural studies, quite often educators were not just solely educators, they had other roles as well. So there are lots of different ways that you can think about this. Liz, I know that you've got a couple of one-place studies, and I don't know if you've got any thoughts about researching education or educational establishments in any of those places.
I think what I've done for my one place study is to make a list of all the schools I know existed, which, as you mentioned, you know, could include faith schools. The first school in the village was a Wesleyan day school. There were also sort of local authority schools later when education became compulsory. My great-great-grandfather's old school is now a tea room. So in the name of research, I've had a cream tea in his old schoolroom, and there were some lovely photos on the wall, you know, which I've snapped a picture of for my own collection. And also I contacted the local school, who still had copies of the old Victorian logbooks, and they very kindly let me go along there and sit in their staff room and go through they're a real reflection on village life at the time, and they record that many children were absent during harvest time because they were out helping in the fields and you know, that kind of thing. So they really are a wealth of information, and it's very interesting to sort of, you know, trace the, you know, perhaps what would education have been like. It's an example where you can marry what you know about education from perhaps looking at legislation at the time, and then apply that to the establishment in your school. Who would their employer have been? Look in the newspapers, was anybody fined for not sending their children to school? Do you see the same names coming up again and again for not sending children to school? So it's very interesting to look at, you know, the development of schooling in the area, the types of different schools there were, you know, but also how people perhaps thought of it. You know, were people glad to send their children to school? You know, it's lots of aspects to education. And of course, as we mentioned in yesterday's video, the schools may not necessarily have been a traditional school, but it might have been a school to learn, you know, a particular craft like lace making. So there could be different types of school. So consider everything.
Yeah, exactly. And just moving on then to our last part of day 5's tasks, which is descriptions of your place. And of course, one of the things that people might have learned in the past is about the history of their own place, you know, an awareness of the local area. But of course, there are lots of descriptions of places, particularly if we think about older local histories, things that maybe were published in the 19th or early 20th centuries, things like literature, guidebooks, directories, that all actually will mention things like schools and educational establishments quite often, as well as other parts of that place. So I think going away and thinking about descriptions of your place can get into education, but also thinking about work, industry, and all of the other kind of things that we've mentioned. Directories are one of the best ones that I think that I've come across. You've also got things like newspapers as well, that you can really dive in, I guess, at whatever level that you feel comfortable. So I think look for descriptions of your place, I think, is a really good thing to think about, just as well as we're now really getting into the meat and the bones of your one place study. I think just maybe stepping back occasionally and thinking about what else has been said about the place in the past, you know, looking up old histories and things like that, and really trying to put all of these different themes, you know, industry, occupation, education, individual interest in people. And the important thing, I think, with a one place study is that we're fitting those all into a wider sense. So I think that's something that it's important to do, you know, so think about these themes and focus down, but don't forget as well to pull yourself back out sometimes and look at the big picture and the context and the community in general. So go away and have a look and see if you can find any descriptions of your place, either contemporary or more recent, and see what that can tell you about it.